It was just supposed to be another quiet afternoon, the kind where the biggest disruption on Oakwood Lane was a kid chasing a basketball into the street, or someone's lawnmower sputtering to life. But as the sun settled behind the rooftops and shadows stretched across the pavement, something was already in motion that would turn this sleepy neighborhood into the center of a storm no one saw coming. And for Roy and Linda Weston, a couple known to their neighbors as the kind-hearted pair who always waved and never asked for anything, the next few minutes would shatter everything they thought they knew about peace and safety. Roy had been under the hood of an old Dodge Ram, working on a transmission leak for his neighbor Greg, who'd mentioned the problem a few days back during one of their usual weekend coffee chats. Roy never said no to someone in need, not when he could help. At 71, he still had the steady hands and sharp mind of the Green Beret he once was, though most people on Oakwood Lane had no idea who he used to be. His military past wasn't on display. No flags, no medals on the walls, just an old duffel in the garage and memories he didn't talk about. He had left that world behind a long time ago, or so he thought. Meanwhile, Linda had just come back from the store. It was Wednesday, and Wednesday was pot roast night. She loved her routines, and so did Roy. She pulled into the driveway in their old blue sedan, the trunk full of groceries, humming softly to herself. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same bun she'd worn since their second date. Her joints ached when she moved, but she never complained. She just carried on, like always. Inside their small but warm home, a framed wedding photo from 1973 rested on a shelf next to a worn recipe book. They had built a life with few luxuries, but an abundance of love. And to anyone looking from the outside, the Westons were just another retired couple living out their golden years in peace. But that illusion cracked the moment Roy noticed something strange. A low rumble, like heavy engines idling just out of sight, reached his ears. He stepped back from the truck and wiped his hands with an old rag, brow furrowed. It wasn't a garbage truck or a delivery van or anything typical for their street. The sound grew louder, more urgent. Then the screeching started, tires on asphalt, fast, aggressive, not caring about curbs or driveways or startled pedestrians. That's when Roy's instincts, long dormant but never gone, kicked in like a switch flipped in his brain. Something was wrong. Before he could move, the first black armored van came into view, followed by another and another. They weren't marked, no sirens, no lights, just brute force and urgency. In seconds, the quiet rhythm of suburban life was ripped apart as tactical vehicles boxed in Oakwood Lane like it was a war zone. Doors flew open, black-clad figures emerged in synchronized bursts, weapons drawn, faces hidden behind visors and masks. Their movements were fast and practiced. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a training exercise. This was real. "Police! Search warrant!" a voice thundered from somewhere near the lead vehicle, amplified and absolute. "Everyone on the ground!" neighbors screamed. Dogs barked. A lawn chair overturned as someone tried to run. Roy's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then one of them, their leader maybe, locked eyes with him and pointed. "You! Hands up now!" Roy didn't resist. He raised his hands slowly, the rag still in one, stained with oil. His voice was calm, confused but steady. "I think you've got the wrong house," he tried to say, but they were already moving toward him. "Down! Face on the ground!" barked another voice, closer now. Roy didn't argue. He dropped to his knees, then his chest, feeling the rough concrete of the driveway press into his cheek. He could hear boots slamming against the pavement all around him, the clatter of gear, the clicking of safeties being switched off. Then came the cold snap of zip ties around his wrists, pulled tight by someone who didn't seem to care who he was. He didn't struggle, he didn't shout, but in his mind, one terrifying truth was becoming clear. Whoever they were looking for, they thought it was him, and they weren't going to ask twice. The cold bite of the zip ties dug deeper into Roy's wrists with each breath, but he didn't flinch. Not even when the barrel of a rifle hovered inches from his head, or when another officer shouted into his earpiece with clipped, frantic urgency. What Roy Weston felt wasn't fear, it was calculation. Every part of him was working like it had years ago, when silence, clarity, and patience had meant the difference between life and death. He listened to the chaos around him, piecing it together in real time. The boots, the shouts, the movement patterns. He knew an organized sweep when he saw one, but he also knew disorganization when it crept in. And something was off. The lead officer, a man in his 40s with a steely jaw and rigid posture, moved like a man confident in orders he didn't double-check. His tone, loud and absolute, was meant to control the room, or in this case, the block. But Roy caught it, the slight hesitation in his voice when he barked out commands, the glances between team members that spoke of confusion just under the surface. They didn't fully know what they were walking into. They thought they did, but they didn't. One of the younger officers shouted, "Clear, garage empty." Another came over the comms, "No movement in the backyard." And yet, all their guns remained drawn. Roy could hear kids crying 2 houses down, someone yelling from a front porch, and the unmistakable sound of a dog barking itself hoarse from behind a closed door. This wasn't a precision hit. This was a net being thrown, and Roy was caught in it. Then came the moment Roy would replay 1,000 times. The engine of a familiar car turned the corner and began slowing down as it approached the driveway. Linda. She was coming home, just like always, exactly on time, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in front of their house. Roy's body tensed, not out of panic, but out of sheer helplessness. He turned his head slightly, enough to see the blue sedan coming to a slow stop in front of the mailbox. She stepped out with 2 brown paper grocery bags, her expression puzzled, her mouth just beginning to form a question. She didn't have time to say anything. 3 officers immediately turned, rifles raised, their adrenaline now laser-focused on a woman holding nothing but food and confusion. "Ma'am, stop where you are. Drop the bags. Hands in the air," one of them screamed. Roy shouted too. "She doesn't understand. Don't—" But he was silenced by a sharp boot to the side, pressed against the asphalt again. Linda looked around, eyes wide, frozen between fear and disbelief. "What's going on? Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. She started to lower the bags, slowly, carefully. But to the men pointing weapons at her, it wasn't fast enough. "Non-compliant subject," a younger officer shouted, his voice high with stress. "Ma'am, this is your final warning." She was trying. Her hands, stiff from years of arthritis, couldn't move quickly. She was lowering the bags, her shoulders shaking, mouth quivering. The bags began to slip, but then came the snap, the unmistakable sound of a taser being fired. In an instant, Linda's body convulsed, the shock ripping through her muscles as she dropped to the pavement with a sickening thud. The grocery bags exploded on impact. A carton of eggs shattered, yolk and shells spraying across the concrete. A jug of milk burst, sending a wave of white foam across her shoes. Apples rolled under the tactical boots of men too focused on protocol to care about what had just happened. Roy's vision went white with rage. Not loud rage, not the kind that lashes out or screams uncontrollably. This was the kind of fury that settles deep into the bones, freezing everything but the core of a man's training. He didn't struggle against his restraints. He didn't plead. He didn't even speak. For a few seconds, he just stared at the young officer who had fired the taser, memorizing his face, watching the transition from righteous command to dawning horror as the reality of what he'd done set in. Linda let out a weak sound, a whimper. That, more than anything, was what made Roy move. His voice cut through the noise, low, steady, and laced with an edge that demanded attention without needing volume. "Let me up," he said. No one moved at first, but then the commanding officer hesitated, sensing that something had just shifted, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't afford to ignore. He gave a sharp nod. Another officer stepped forward, blade in hand, and without a word sliced the zip ties. Roy slowly rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, controlled. He didn't rush to his wife, yet. Every part of him wanted to, but that would mean turning his back on a group of people who had already proven they could act recklessly. First, he had to contain the threat. He walked toward the commanding officer, not aggressively, not submissively, just straight. The others tensed, unsure whether to intervene. But the air around Roy had changed. It carried weight now, like a storm building before the first crack of thunder. He stopped just feet from the commander, their eyes locked. Then Roy spoke 5 words, and the entire world stopped. The 5 words hung in the air like a guillotine suspended mid-fall. "Call General Bryce, right now." It wasn't a threat, not even a command in the traditional sense, but the effect was immediate and electric. The rifles didn't lower, yet, but they stopped shifting. Fingers eased off triggers. Eyes darted between each other, between Roy and their commander, between confusion and something bordering on dread. The younger officers didn't recognize the name. They were trained for situations, not legends, but the captain, he did. Or at least he recognized enough to feel the gravity start pulling hard beneath his boots. General Bryce wasn't a name you threw around lightly, not in their world. Not unless you had the clearance to say it, and the consequences to back it up. Roy said it like someone who'd sat across from the man, not just once, but enough times to say it with a familiarity that couldn't be faked. The tension shifted like a change in barometric pressure. Something invisible was pushing down on the entire scene, the kind of weight you feel just before something breaks. The commanding officer, Captain Dawson, took one step forward, jaw clenched. "What did you say?" he asked, not because he hadn't heard, but because he needed to be sure. Roy didn't repeat himself. He just looked at him, a steady, unblinking stare. Not a single flicker of doubt. That silence said more than any explanation ever could. "This is 219 Oakwood Lane," Roy added, calmly, deliberately. "You're looking for 219 Oakwood Avenue. It's a dispatch error. They happen in this county all the time. You're at the wrong house." Captain Dawson hesitated. That wasn't public knowledge. The address confusion, two streets with nearly identical names in separate jurisdictions, had been flagged before during internal briefings. But the fact that this man knew it cold, without panic or second guessing, was enough to rattle even a seasoned officer's footing. Then Roy delivered the final blow. "You have 2 minutes to verify that before this becomes a classified incident of national consequence." He stepped in even closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, deadlier. "And if my wife suffers even a second longer because of that rookie's itchy finger, General Bryce will be the least of your problems." The captain's expression flickered, just briefly, but enough for anyone paying attention to see it. The younger officers exchanged glances, some confused, some now visibly uncertain. The kid who had fired the taser looked pale, sick even. His breathing was shallow. He probably thought it was just a routine escalation, a justified takedown of a non-compliant suspect. But now he was starting to understand that he had just pulled the trigger on something far bigger than he was ever prepared for. Captain Dawson turned sharply, barking into his radio. "Confirm warrant details, double-check the address right now, and get a medic to the female, stat." His tone had changed, no longer barking orders like a conqueror. Now it was clipped, urgent, uncertain. Roy didn't wait for a reply. He walked over to where Linda lay, her body limp, breathing shallow. The medic had just knelt beside her, unzipping a kit. Roy crouched slowly, his hand trembling just slightly as he reached out for hers. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said softly, brushing her hair back from her face. "It's going to be okay." But inside he was anything but calm. He could see it in her coloring, the faint bluish tint along her lips, the way her fingers twitched involuntarily. Her heart was vulnerable. Years ago, they'd caught a rhythm abnormality during a routine check. Not enough for surgery, not life-threatening on its own, but something that could become deadly if shocked the wrong way. Like with a high-voltage taser fired at close range. Every second without proper medical attention was another roll of the dice. He looked up briefly, and when his eyes met Captain Dawson's, there was no longer a trace of uncertainty in Roy's gaze, only a warning, and it was received loud and clear. The address confirmation came through like a hammer. "Target apprehended already. Oakwood Avenue. Repeat, suspect in custody 20 minutes ago. Wrong location. We're at the wrong damn house." Captain Dawson visibly froze. His earpiece crackled again. Another voice, more frantic this time. "Sir, you need to call in command. There's a flag on this guy's ID. High tier, real high, JSOC level." Dawson looked at Roy, then made his decision. He radioed in the priority code, Alpha Line, highest urgency, and requested immediate contact with General Bryce. Not the regional field commander, not state. Bryce. The name you only invoked when things had gone catastrophically sideways. It wasn't procedure, it was damage control. The line took a few seconds to connect. Roy sat next to Linda, keeping her hand warm in his own, eyes never straying far from her face. He whispered softly to her, murmuring words only she could hear, grounding her in that moment, doing what he could to keep her with him. And all the while, the world around them held its breath. Officers who had stormed this house like soldiers now stood uncertain, some with their weapons lowered, others simply staring at the man who had just rewritten their entire reality in less than 5 minutes. Then the call went live, and General Bryce's voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the static like a scalpel. What followed wasn't a conversation, it was a reckoning. The voice on the other end of the line was low and rough, like gravel scraped across steel. It was unmistakable. "This is General Bryce. Who the hell is calling me on Alpha priority during a civilian op?" The moment that voice hit the airwaves, the air shifted. Captain Dawson's jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. He swallowed hard. "Sir, this is Captain Dawson, SWAT Unit 6A, Jefferson County. We have a situation. A possible misidentified target. A civilian has been injured." There was a pause. Then Bryce's voice dropped even lower. "Name." The captain didn't speak right away. He looked at Roy, who was still crouched beside his wife, her hand clutched gently in his. "The name he gave us is Weston. Roy Weston." Another pause, longer this time. The kind that doesn't just carry silence, it carries weight. The kind that means something just landed in the middle of a chessboard and knocked every piece over. General Bryce's response was immediate, sharp. "Roy Weston was never to be engaged, under any circumstance. You mean to tell me you touched him?" The captain hesitated, his voice thinner now, stripped of command. "Sir, we didn't know the intel—" But Bryce cut him off like a blade. "What happened?" Captain Dawson closed his eyes for a second before forcing the words out. "We deployed Taser on a female subject, his wife, civilian non-compliance during the sweep. It was a mistake." The silence on the other end this time was ice cold. "I'm on my way," Bryce said at last. "ETA 14 minutes, nobody moves, nobody speaks to him. Secure the scene and wait for federal containment." And then the line went dead. Every officer on the scene was suddenly very, very aware of how badly things had just gone. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was dread. Half the team had no idea who Roy really was, but they knew the signs. The sudden command from the top of the food chain, the way their captain looked like someone had taken a bat to his ribs, the sense that they were no longer in control of the situation, not even slightly. Meanwhile, Roy had remained quiet, still watching Linda's breathing. The medic had stabilized her for the moment, set up an IV, and checked her vitals. But there was no hiding the concern in his eyes. "She needs to be transported," the medic said almost in a whisper, as if afraid the sound of his own voice might shatter something. Roy nodded once, not saying a word. Captain Dawson stepped forward cautiously, now more of a man than a commanding presence. "Mr. Weston, sir, I've ordered emergency air evac. Cardiac trauma team en route. The general. He's coming here, personally." Roy slowly turned to look at him, and for the first time his eyes weren't burning with restrained fury. They were dead calm. That was somehow worse. "It's Weston now, is it?" he said, voice low. "Not suspect. Not get on the ground. Not hands where I can see them." The captain opened his mouth, but Roy cut him off. "You tased a 70-year-old woman holding groceries. You screamed at her like she was a threat, and now you're scrambling to put a lid on what you just spilled. That's not justice, that's panic." Captain Dawson tried again. "It wasn't personal, we had a warrant. We thought this house so—" Roy stood up slowly, his height, even at his age, commanding without effort. "You didn't think. You acted. That's what makes it worse. You weren't wrong because you lacked information. You were wrong because you didn't question it. You didn't care enough to ask." He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping across the team. "That woman on the ground? She's been my anchor through a life you people couldn't begin to understand. You have no idea the things I've done for this country, and she's the one thing that's kept me from breaking. You came into my home and broke her instead." No one spoke. Not one officer dared meet his eyes. Then came the hum, a deep, thrumming vibration that grew louder by the second. Everyone turned. Over the treetops, 2 sleek black helicopters emerged, the kind that didn't bear insignias, didn't show up on civilian flight radar, and weren't available to local enforcement under any protocol. They descended quickly but precisely, kicking up a storm of dust and leaves as they touched down in the middle of Oakwood Lane like they owned it. From the first chopper stepped out a small group of agents in tailored suits, each of them wearing discreet earpieces and carrying specialized hard cases. They didn't look like local law enforcement. They looked like the people who trained the people who trained the people local law enforcement tried to become. Their movements were quick, economical, and lethal, in the kind of way you only recognized if you'd once moved like that yourself. Then General Bryce stepped out of the second chopper. Even in a plain field uniform, dusted with the grime of travel, he was unmistakable. Broad-shouldered, heavy-set, eyes sharp as razors. He didn't speak to Captain Dawson, didn't so much as glance at him. He walked straight to Roy and stopped. Not an ounce of pretense. "Roy," he said, voice low, raw. "You and Linda all right?" Roy looked down at his wife, then back at the man who had once sent him into missions buried under more black ink than could fit on a briefing page. "She's not okay," Roy said quietly. "Not after what they did." General Bryce nodded once. Then finally, he turned toward the rest of the assembled officers, his expression like thunder behind a wall of ice. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Every man there understood instantly that the storm had just arrived, and it was wearing stars. The moment General Bryce arrived, everything changed. The air grew heavier, the energy on that suburban street crackling with tension that no one dared touch. He didn't have to announce himself or flash credentials. His presence was the credential. The black-suited agents who flanked him immediately fanned out, taking over the perimeter with quiet efficiency. Radios that had been buzzing moments earlier fell silent. Every SWAT officer who had charged into that home now stood like a statue, waiting for the fallout they all knew was coming. General Bryce knelt beside Linda, assessing her condition with clinical precision and visible concern. His voice dropped low as he exchanged a few words with the medic, then turned to Roy. "She's stable, but we're not taking any chances," he said. "She'll be taken to the nearest cardiac trauma unit, not the local hospital, Level 1 military facility, classified location. She'll be under federal protection and top medical care until she's fully recovered." Roy gave a single nod, the kind of wordless agreement forged in a lifetime of missions where time was the only enemy. He didn't say thank you. Bryce didn't expect him to. It wasn't necessary. Within minutes, one of the helicopters was being prepped for emergency medevac. Linda was gently lifted onto a specialized gurney, her vitals continuously monitored as the agents moved with speed and grace. Roy climbed in after her, not bothering to ask if he was allowed to accompany her. He didn't need permission. Bryce turned back to the officers on the ground, eyes sweeping the scene like searchlights, each glance leaving a mark. Captain Dawson stepped forward, bracing for impact, trying to pull some shred of protocol together. "Sir, he began, but Bryce cut him off without raising his voice. "You're done." The words landed like hammer strikes. "Effective immediately. You've been relieved of command. Internal Affairs will take your statement. Legal will have questions. And if it's up to me, your badge will be in a desk drawer by sundown, right next to your pension paperwork." Dawson didn't argue. He simply lowered his head, knowing there was no redemption coming. Bryce's gaze shifted to the young officer who had pulled the trigger, the one whose hand had gripped the taser, the one who had misread an elderly woman's fear as resistance. That officer couldn't even lift his eyes. He was visibly trembling, his fingers twitching like he was still holding the weapon. Bryce didn't shout, he just walked up and stared at him, close enough that the officer could feel every ounce of authority pressing into him like a stone wall. "You want to wear the uniform," Bryce said, voice quiet and lethal. "You better learn the weight of what it means. You don't fire because you're scared. You don't fire because you're impatient. You fire because there is no other choice, and this," he motioned to the wreckage of what had once been a quiet driveway, "was never your call to make." The young officer swallowed hard, nodding mutely. His future was already written in that moment, and it wasn't in uniform. Behind them, the suited agents were already securing digital footage from neighborhood security systems, locking down communications, and pulling the body cams from every officer who had stepped foot on that property. Bryce's voice carried again. "This incident is now federal. All reports are sealed under direct order. The full review will be conducted by Joint Special Oversight. Every move, every word, every trigger pull will be documented, reconstructed, and judged. This is no longer your op, this is ours." As the helicopters lifted off, one carrying Linda and Roy into the safety of the sky, the officers who remained behind weren't just stunned. They were changed. You could see it in their faces, the recognition that they hadn't just made a mistake. They had detonated a landmine hidden in plain sight, and now the shockwave would ripple far beyond their own ranks. News of the incident didn't make the headlines. There were no press conferences, no front-page stories. What happened on Oakwood Lane disappeared from the public eye before it even had a chance to reach it. But inside the law enforcement world, the story spread like wildfire, quietly, through the kind of channels that don't leave paper trails, whispers in briefing rooms, stunned recountings in training sessions, urgent memos from high-ranking officials to departments across the state. Every version of the story ended with the same line. They hit the wrong house, and the man inside wasn't just anyone. Linda made a full recovery. Her heart, miraculously, hadn't sustained long-term damage, though the trauma lingered. Roy stayed by her side through every test, every sleepless night. The agents ensured she received not just care, but protection. There were still questions about the cartel suspect the SWAT team had been chasing, whether the cartel might come looking for whoever had orchestrated the raid. So General Bryce arranged for a silent security detail. Plain clothes, discreet, but armed with the kind of clearance that moved mountains without noise. A week later, Roy and Linda returned to their home. The groceries were gone. The driveway had been scrubbed, but the memory remained etched into the concrete and into every fibre of their being. Neighbours were careful now, not out of fear, but out of respect. Roy wasn't just the friendly guy who fixed lawnmowers and helped with busted gutters. He was something else, something most of them would never fully understand. Roy didn't talk about what happened, not to anyone. He didn't sue, he didn't go to the press, he didn't want revenge or attention. He just wanted his wife to be okay, and for the peace they had worked so hard to build to remain intact. But inside precincts and federal training centers, his name became a cautionary legend. A reminder that not everyone who looks ordinary is ordinary. That authority doesn't always wear a uniform. That the deadliest person in a room might be the one who speaks the softest. And that sometimes 5 words, spoken with quiet certainty, can do more to stop an armed unit in its tracks than 100 shouted commands ever could.